My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Dr. Patrick Newman, who's got a great, well-received book we're going to touch on and has a lot of interesting thoughts when it comes to the Fed. Dr. Newman, introduce yourself here to the audience. Who are you? How'd you get involved and interested in economics? And what are you doing now?
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. So my name is Patrick Newman. I'm a professor of economics at Florida Southern College. That's right outside the beautiful city of Tampa, Florida, where I currently reside and I live. So the couple best things about Florida is it's always warm, which is great. I've been interested in economics since the financial crisis. That's when I got into it. I got into economics originally through Ron Paul. Pretty big Austrian economist. I've done a lot of work in Austrian economics, Austrian business cycle theory. I do a lot of work in economic history. I do current forecasting for some investment companies. So I'm all over the place, and I pretty much just live, eat, breathe, and sleep economics. So I'm here to talk about the economy, right?
Do you find that the criticisms around economists are unfair? I mean, it's always sort of the joke of, what's that old saying, right? You know, somebody's an economist if they say on the one hand and then on the other hand. To talk about sort of the field of economics from the standpoint of the kind of popular perception out there and what's right and what's wrong about it.
Yeah, so definitely some of the common criticisms of economics or economists are absolutely true. Economists always equivocate. They always, I do this myself, basically balance, say, well, this could happen, but this could also happen. This is all part of the ceteris paribus assumption. Economists are trying to apply theories and forecast the future, which in many ways can be a fool's game, but that's, of course, where the money is. The old joke among economists is if people ask, I tell people, they say, "Oh, I'm an economist," and they say, "Oh, you know how to make a lot of money?" And I said, "Well, if I knew how to make a lot of money, I wouldn't be an economist. I can tell you about money, I can tell you about theories, but of course, trying to predict things is that's where the real skill, that's where the entrepreneurial function comes from." And of course, a lot of economists now, they're very, very mathematical. I myself got one of my majors in undergrad. As an undergrad, was in mathematics, so I understand that. But economists, very, very elaborate formulas, and their predictions aren't always great, even with those formulas. We've all heard how inflation was going to be transitory, then it turned out to be a bigger problem than a lot of economists thought. And it's the old joke is economist models are always great at predicting the past. It's the future that they still haven't gotten.
So it's interesting, right? So a lot of people would criticize the Fed in the sense that obviously there's a lot of economists there. They're trying to, some would argue, predict the future. I'd argue that they're trying to predict the future by creating it through monetary policy, which I think is a line from Abraham Lincoln. Best way to predict the future is to create it. And since you alluded to the point that a lot of the models were wrong post-COVID, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why is it that, let's call it the vast majority of the economic community, of the economist community, couldn't see what we're in now.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think the biggest reason is because over the past 10 or so years, the traditional channel of how the monetary policy affects prices was basically broken since the financial crisis, when the Federal Reserve, through QE infinity, was just pumping in more and more reserves in the system. And there were many economists, at least initially, predicting high inflation from that, but it did not result. There was not high inflation. This is because the Fed is also paying interest on excess reserves, and this caused banks to not lend the money out, among various other factors. And so then, when fast forward to COVID, a lot of people thought that, well, we could just increase the bank reserves, and we could also increase the money supply. We could hand out stimulus checks, paycheck protection program, loans, all of that stuff, and we'll be fine. There won't be high inflation. And it was a case of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? And basically the economists got burned because they got greedy, and they thought they thought they could up the size of the stimulus packages without realizing that, well, things were a little different this time, and it will cause inflation, which is exactly what happened.
How much does that relate to sort of the let's call it the fallacy of precision? And I say that because there is this impression out there that the Federal Reserve is able to thread the needle. They have all this data, and so they must know exactly the right amount of dollars to print or reserves to put out, and the exact amount of rates to rise. History would suggest that there's a precision error issue there, right? That they really can't identify exactly where rates should be.
Oh, absolutely. So there's a massive amount of economists who are employed by the Fed, which explains why economists are always so bullish on the Fed or confident in the Fed. Is that, well, that's how they're getting a lot of their money, but that's a whole conversation that we could get into. But definitely economists are very focused on making point predictions rather than pattern predictions. So saying, okay, we're going to get quantitative precision. You're trying to mimic the natural sciences, the hard sciences. You're trying to say, okay, well, we can say with certainty, if we increase rates like by this amount, then inflation will fall to this amount in the future. And there's a lot of variables. There's a lot of things that can change. There's a lot of moving pieces to the economy, and that economists aren't always focused on or aren't always looking at. And we have all this data. A big problem is a lot of this data, especially over the past couple of years, this has even happened over the past couple of months, gets revised by the government. The government releases data, it comes out, markets react, and then in a couple later reports down the line, the data gets revised in a way that maybe markets are saying, oh, well, we didn't anticipate that. Now we have to adjust what we're doing. And we've seen this in the unemployment numbers, we've seen this in inflation numbers, we've seen this in wages, and there's just a lot of volatility, which is making it very hard for these mathematically ornate models to predict economic phenomenon accurately.
No, and actually, that's exactly sort of you said it better than I did. I mean, it's the revisions which shows you that it was never precise to begin with, and even from an investing perspective, it's remarkable, right? The stock market will react off of the data that's released, like we just saw with strong jobs numbers, but then if it gets revised months down the line, the stock market doesn't seemingly care about revisions. It's always about the headline, not sort of the true number, which you only find out over time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so sometimes you will see the market brush it off. A lot of times this happens. Economists, I guess, are looking more under the hood and also more focused on the past because they're not as. It's more about trends and stuff like that. And that's also part of the confidence game that the Fed plays to sort of circle back to what you're getting at earlier. The Fed over the past several decades has gotten very good, or at least thinks it's very good at trying to steer a certain narrative and make market participants believe what they're saying. And this is regarding a speech Jay Powell will make, and markets always seem to rally, or what the Fed says, okay, this is what's happening now. Markets are confident in them. You could change a number, the headline number. Markets are very forward looking. So changing backward a number in the past might actually make the economic situation not look as good. But again, as long as they're always able to keep the focus on the future, then they can keep doing what they're doing, and it's very future focused, and it's always there's always a way of shaping the data, or reading the data to fit your narrative. There's an old joke in economics, and it goes, well, when you're doing research, you're supposed to torture the data until it confesses, right? And that's that's what a lot of people do, including the Federal Reserve.
That confidence point also, I think, is a really important one, and that relates to behavioral economics, behavioral finance. I caught a bit of Jeffrey Gundlach's interview not too long ago, and he was talking about Powell's posture, right, as a sign of confidence, and that's what the stock market wanted to see. That there's almost a body language to the way that policy is being conveyed. Is that sort of a new phenomenon where moral suasion is a bigger and bigger part of the Fed trying to shape the future? I mean, it's always been a tool, right? Words have always been a way that the Fed has tried to, in quotes, alter perception, which you can argue is manipulation, which we can maybe talk about. But how much is the Fed now more focused on sort of the psychological or behavioral aspects of monetary policy as opposed to just the set number of interest rates?
Yeah, I'd say they've certainly more focused on it now. It's been around for a while. So Alan Greenspan, he was the Fed chair in the 90s and the early 2000s, before the housing bubble, before Ben Bernanke. And this was before the age of the internet, at least when it really took off. He was seen as kind of the oracle, right? And everyone would always focus, they'd fixate on what he'd say. A couple words, or if he'd start focusing on the price of men's underwear or some other indicator, this is now everyone would focus on that, and everyone would try to digest what he was saying because slight changes in what he was saying could mean lots of money to be made in bond trades and other securities trades, et cetera. And I would say increasingly over the decades, especially over the past decade, and then especially in the post-COVID era, the Fed is definitely focused on the psychology, particularly because it's kind of destroyed the traditional monetary transmission mechanism of how uh, increasing bank reserves lead to an increase in prices, right? So the increase in bank reserves, banks will loan out the money, the increase in the money supply that has to get spent. That increases demand for goods, increases prices. And ever since they were paying interest on excess reserves, they were able to basically kind of weaken that. And now in the age of social media, right? This is now when Fed pronouncements get digested on social media. Everyone can comment on it. Everyone's got all their data they can throw up. This isn't the age of looking at newspapers or even just going online in some lead articles on big news outlets. This is everyone's got an opinion. Everyone can always talk about what's going on, and you can see real time how leading forecasters or leading economists, policy analysts, etc., are interpreting something. There's definitely a lot in psychology, especially because a lot of people will make investment decisions, make spending decisions based on what they read on Twitter and other social media outlets. And so the Fed is definitely recognizing that it has to keep people's confidence. And that was ultimately what worried the Fed around May and June of last year, because it was like the third time in a row the Fed said inflation was going to fall, and it was proven wrong. And that was when they said, okay, we want to keep we want to keep markets confident. We want to look credible. So now we're going to have to start to tighten. So the Fed is very, very focused on the psychology. I assume Powell's remarks are are heavily vetted. They're certainly he's got people he talks to. Everyone wants to make sure that a message is being conveyed.
It's an interesting thing to think through, this idea that social media also alters the game for the Federal Reserve. I wonder if you've seen or looked at any studies or done any studies around how social media impacts inflation expectations, which can create sort of a self-fulfilling cycle of either higher or lower prices, right? I mean, to the extent that everyone's talking about egg prices going higher, or whatever it would be, and it gets retweeted and liked, it creates almost a feeling of, well, you better buy now before prices go up later. And if more and more people are getting that through social media, it almost goes up just because everyone else is afraid it goes up.
Oh, absolutely. The beginning of 2021, so really when the economy was starting to reopen, people were starting to spend all of the stimmy money, so to speak. I was commenting to various people, talking with people, and I was thinking, like, looking at social media when even just people see pictures of lumber prices, right? Remember when the lumber prices skyrocketed early
Oh,
on,
I remember. It is my
yeah,
right eye. It is my
yeah.
right eye on Twitter.
Yeah, and then all the various stocks and et cetera, even Bitcoin at one point. That information gets basically communicated to people much faster than what used to happen before. You can sit on your couch and you can learn about what price is changing right now and what people are thinking about it right now from your smartphone. Before, you couldn't even do that. You'd have forecasters that have the TV on, some news outlet focused on finance that have some articles up, or even before the internet, you just have the TV and newspapers. Now, social media definitely can allow that inflationary expectations to feed, and it can also allow inflationary disexpectations or deflationary expectations or disinflationary. We can get into all that to settle in, and certain people's Twitter accounts, when you've got millions of followers or more, someone like a Paul Krugman, if they are holding a certain line, that can absolutely influence markets. So it's a big part of the psychology, and it's how you're able to communicate your message. Releasing articles on social media, et cetera, and it definitely absolutely plays a role. And I think inflationary expectations are more volatile in the age of social media than they were even, say, 8 to 10 years ago.
Right, and the problem is you can't really get to a place of thinking about nuance when it comes to social media, right? So, and I think that's maybe a transition to sort of where we are now from your vantage point. People see strong jobs numbers and they think that means the Fed has to keep on raising rates because it means more inflation. We now got to a point where social media over the last year trained everybody to think that every data point is solely about inflation as opposed to real growth. right? Which I think is just an interesting aspect of behavior and psychology here. Um, Talk through for the audience your view on uh, can the Fed really thread the needle, and is the inflation narrative now maybe wrong? I named this space purposely. There's no landing for the Fed because, from my vantage point, it's either they overdo it or we take back off on growth, just as everybody's still very bearish.
Yeah, so that's of course the $1 million question. So in some of my forecasts, I've been distinguishing. Of course, you hear soft landing and hard landing, right? The soft landing is they're able to bring inflation back down to 2% without causing a significant rise in employment to at least derail growth. People thought maybe that was not going to happen early last year. We were going to have the hard landing when GDP was starting to decline. The hard landing is, of course, the recession. I've been saying it's possible. A likely scenario. I'm kind of dealing with plane analogies here. Is you're going to have a skid landing, right? So the plane is going to land. It's not going to blow up, but there's going to be turbulence. There's going to be some damage to the plane. You might not see a huge increase in unemployment or this dramatic stock market crash like we saw in '08 or in March of 2020, but you will see some real effects of stagnant real wages, just permanently lower growth. So that's a possibility. Earlier in, I guess not in the year, so last year around the fall, people were expecting a recession, myself included, at some point early this year. The past couple months have seen data come in, inflation's been falling, right? And the jobs numbers are very strong. And GDP was the numbers that came out fourth quarter very strong. One of the reasons is high inventory count, which we could talk about regarding GDP. Earnings reports are also kind of fluctuates. But, now it's kind of on par with what people was expecting, maybe a little bit better. Earlier is a little bit worse. There's still a lot of companies that need to come in. But so people are saying, okay, it seems as though things are landing, right? Where we are making our descent. Inflation is falling. We haven't really hit a lot of turbulence, and I think we're going to see right now. At least my estimates are that it's possible. The economy's sort of underlying inflation that's caused by monetary factors and not by just supply side factors, Ukraine war, the COVID reopening, supply chain bottlenecks, etc., is around 4 to maybe as high as 4.5%, which isn't as bad as 9.1, right? This is what we hit in June, but it's still significantly above the Fed's target. And once we get to that range of say 5% and below, if the Fed keeps tightening, I think we'll start to see more effects then. But right now, the markets are kind of positioning themselves for, okay, you could see more growth. People are going out and spending, and this could cause prices to sort of stabilize around that growth rate. And we even saw this in the jobs numbers regarding the wage growth over the past couple months. We're starting to see this, a little bit of an uptick in used car prices. There was a bump in gas prices in January. Looks to be receding, but it's still kind of reflective of that trend that really we're not going to hit that hard landing yet because there hasn't been enough contraction to actually push us into that danger territory, and we're just kind of the supply side shocks are dissipating, and we're still around that 4 to 4.5% inflation, and that's when the new debate is going to begin. Does the Fed just throw in the towel and accept a higher inflation rate of anywhere from maybe say 3.5% to 4.5%? Or does it go all the way and tighten? And I think if it goes all the way and tighten, you'll start to see more of those hard landing, symptoms. But right now, this is where the market is. We could just be at a the money printing is just causing the inflation rate to rise, stabilize around 4 to 4.5%.
And correct if I'm wrong on this, but I'm fairly certain that most in quotes hard landings happen because of over tightening into a rollover of debt, right? Where you have sort of a refinancing crisis. I mean, there were elements of that from '07 to '08. I think there may be some elements of that because a lot of new loans post COVID at very low rates mature in 3 to 4 years back then, which means we could see a tsunami of loans that have to roll over into higher rates next year with a lot of these zombie companies. Um, how does how do economists, how does the Fed think about these kind of junctures in time where a lot of loans have to be rolled over? Because that, I think, is really sort of the real risk. I always go back to this point that the Fed doesn't care about the stock market; they care about credit spreads. The transmission mechanism of the stock market to credit spreads, default risk, is around volatility, which is why they try to lower rates to squash volatility with liquidity.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's definitely something on their mind. And it's also on a lot of market analysts' minds because what basically the market is expecting now is we've seen this play out over and over again since January of last year. It's been basically bear rallies the whole way, right? The market declines. Then people think that, okay, inflation's going to be transitory, the Fed's got this under control, or the Fed's not going to need to raise rates this much, or it's only going to need to raise rates to X, and then it'll start to cut in the future. So we can already just start planning on that lower rate. And then the Fed says something, when more data comes out, the market goes down, then it goes up again. And are we in a new cycle of sort of maybe a more sustainable bear rally, or just a rally, or a recovery? Of course, we could get into that. The Fed though does the Fed wants to make sure, at least it's posturing, that it wants to get rid of inflation, and markets are kind of hoping that this is going to be temporary for the reasons you mentioned. That I almost think it's not so much as the height of the peak federal funds rate. It's more of how long are they actually going to keep it at an elevated rate, right? More than, say, even just 1%, or even below where it was at for so many years. If the Fed has to keep the federal funds rate at above 4% for not just through this year, but maybe even next year, yeah, as you said, there's a lot of companies, a lot of zombie companies, they're going to have to start. They're going to need to keep borrowing, and that's really going to squeeze their costs, and especially, let's not forget, the biggest borrower is Uncle Sam, right? And Uncle Sam wants to keep its interest payments low and manageable. And this is what markets are worried about, that the Fed's going to actually have to maintain the federal funds rate in an elevated period for several years. It's not just going to be, okay, we spike it up, and then once inflation's back down, the Fed's just going to cut rates and everything's going to be normal. I think that's what a lot of people are hoping for, and that's not going to be likely. And yeah, we could be setting ourselves up for a position where, yeah, you are going to see with this tight money is going to hit the hard wall of banks and or really businesses and financial institutions needing to borrow. And yeah, that's when you could see the effects of the hard landing. And we've seen this in 2008. We also saw this really in the early 80s. This is the scenario a lot of people are talking about regarding, because that's when we had high inflation in the 70s. And that's what they want to avoid, because once you start to see tightening and the credit market squeeze up, then you can move more into the financial crisis, or big declines in the stock market, or other sorts of issues, contagion to Main Street, that the mainstream economists and the Fed are always so very worried about.
Yeah, and I think that's also the challenge around the sort of question of long run inflation, because I think we can all agree that we want to see efficiency in the system, which means some of these zombie companies probably should go away. But you do that, now you're reducing competition, right? So I always go back to this point that one way you can solve inflation is with just more companies competing against each other, but you've got more and more oligopolies in pretty much every industry. So you end up having these kind of rolling crises, which wipes out a bunch of companies, consolidates power among just a few companies. Then they have the bargaining power and pricing power, and inflation stays elevated just because of that.
Mm-hmm. One of the narratives that we heard in the during the inflation period was, okay, this was especially big among commentators such as Robert Reich, was that, well, the inflation is caused by greedy companies. It's greed inflation. There are these large companies, they have this market power, they're just able to raise prices, look at profits, so on and so forth. And I was always big on trying to dispel that, saying that, well, the main reason we saw inflation was it was an increase in the money supply that was led to an increase in spending. Certainly, large companies could play a role. We've seen after COVID, a lot of small businesses go out of they went bankrupt, or they didn't reopen. and adhering to a lot of regulations, mask mandates, vaccines, etc. Generally benefit larger companies who are able to absorb those compliance costs. So that is part of it. Ultimately, market power or market concentration can lead companies to basically try to cartelize. I've done a lot of work on this, where they restrict supply and they raise prices. I don't think it's a major reason, but it's definitely something to look into, particularly as to what's the government policy that is intentionally or unintentionally encouraging market consolidation and bigger companies, right? And so a lot of times, of course, the market is wondering about or worried about what are the earnings of these various a lot of large companies. And how is this affecting Main Street? If it's affecting Main Street, a lot of the big tech companies, we've seen these headlines that they've been laying off workers and that this is going to portend job losses elsewhere. We haven't seen that yet, but it's definitely something on a lot of people's mind. And it's definitely something that I think the financial markets monitor.
So since you mentioned market power and concentration, I feel like that's a good transition to your book, Cronyism. Because when I hear those terms, I think about cronyism to some extent. Do a quick pitch for the audience. First of all, what's the book about? Why'd you decide to read it, to write it rather? It's got some great reviews on Amazon. I'm going to put it on my own list here. But talk about the interest in historical cronyism.
Yeah, so cronyism is special interest policies, right? So they're policies that benefit special interests at the expense of the public. So we can think about a subsidy to a large company that it's at the taxpayer's expense, or we think about protective tariffs that benefit an entrenched firm. And I was asked by someone, I was given a research grant to write a history of crony capitalism in the United States. And I'm working on this in multiple books. So the first book is from 1607 to 1849. It's really from 1789 to 1849. I speed through the colonial era fairly quickly and just going through all of the various crony policies that were pushed at the federal, state, and local level. Who are the interests that we're looking to benefit? I'm currently working on the next book, kind of really taking it up till after World War II. And then I'm hoping to go one final book to the modern era. And it's certainly relevant to today. We could talk about all sorts of connections regarding major players, political and economic players now. But I think it's important to educate the public on how policy worked in the past, because a lot of times people think that, we just need to go back to the good old days of something. And well, my answer is that there really weren't the good old days ever. There were always politicians trying to enrich themselves. There were always politicians working for various economic interests that were lobbying them, et cetera. And a lot of the policies throughout history, really almost all of them, I would say, they're always advertised as benefiting the public interest, but they really just benefit concentrated special interests. And we see this with the Fed. The Fed is supposed to stabilize, financial markets and provide stability and help the economy, et cetera. And looking at the history of central banks, our earlier central banks, as well as the history of the Federal Reserve, kind of exists to benefit the banks, particularly Wall Street, right? They're the major lobbyists behind it. A lot of people who work at the Fed or who, such as Jay Powell, for one, used to work on Wall Street, et cetera. And there's always these interests that people don't really realize, but it's important as an economist, especially as a historian, to highlight these relationships to show people, okay, this is how it actually happened.
How do you actually find that data and those narratives? I mean, I have to assume a lot of the things historically that were special interest driven were under the table and not really talked about openly.
Yeah, so there are archives. There's also old books, especially a lot of biographies, and it's especially very. I own a lot of books, but also in the age of the internet, there are a lot of books that are put up. And this is from regarding some period in the past that there might not be a reliable internet article on, but it's really just reading a lot, primary sources, secondary sources, and seeing what comes up. A lot of histories in the past, they would mention these crony connections almost just as an aside, like a throwaway, or they would kind of dismiss it. And so the data is there. It's actually, it's for the public consumption. It's just no one was there to actually, one, connect it with some other event or really provide the proper interpretation of it, especially when they're biographies of people. They're quite hagiographical, and they're very laudatory. They praise the person, or they just cut. They say, well, this actually wasn't the real motivation or something. You're going like, well, actually, looking at this, or maybe even this own line you have in this book or this article, it's clearly very different. And so it's just a lot of detective work. Being a good historian means that you've got to be a good detective, whether you're studying things in the past or in the more recent era, say over the past couple of years.
Just to reset the room for everybody here for the remaining 28 minutes, everybody please make sure you follow Dr. Patrick Newman here on Twitter. And if you're curious, check out Cronyism, available on Amazon and various other places. Again, I will have this as an edited podcast on all your favorite platforms under Lead Lag Live. And if any of you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button to come up. I'm curious, were there certain special interest dynamics or certain cronyism dynamics that really stood out to you in a really bizarre way that made you say, "Wow, I can't believe that actually happened"?
Yeah. There's a couple of them. A classic example I always give is why is the capital where it is? Right? Why is Washington D.C. in the precise location that it is? And there's a whole story behind this. Hamilton is trying to push for this assumption of old debts to benefit speculators. There are people who are against this. This was tied in with the location of the nation's capital. Early on, Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson agreed. They say, all right, we assume these debts, and we're going to move the capital from New York City temporarily to Philadelphia, and then we're going to put the permanent capital somewhere on the Potomac, and we're going to give our first president, our new president, George Washington, the ability to decide precisely where in this box, this certain land area, where the capital will be. And what's funny is then when you go to the story of the chartering of the first Bank of the United States, our nation's first central bank. Long story short, Washington was actually thinking about vetoing this. Even after hearing Hamilton's remarks, he was thinking about vetoing it. But there was one problem: it's that Washington was deciding where the capital was going to be, and he didn't want it in that box, in that specific land area around the Potomac. He wanted it a little bit closer to Alexandria. He wanted it outside of that box. Why? Because that's where his plantation was, Mount Vernon. So the actual story of how we got our first central bank and where the nation's capital is that the powers that be in Congress said, look, we'll let you put the capital, we'll let you choose the capital so it's closer to your property, right? Of course, which leads to a huge increase in the value of your property, Mount Vernon and related lands. But you got to sign the bank bill. and yeah, this is discussed in some older histories. There's a book that came out recently called The First Congress. It talks about this, and yeah, it's just so blatant. I'm going, oh, okay, wow, that's that's quite interesting. A lot of people don't know this. That yes, George Washington, he was motivated to increase the value of his land, and this was tied in with monetary policy, and it also just gives a great explanation of why our nation's capital is where it is. But there's a lot of examples like this, both in the past. I could go through some more recent ones in my current research. Just there's always a special interest behind something, and it's really about looking far enough under the hood to see, okay, who was lobbying for what and who stood to gain.
Was there ever? I have to assume there's some period in history where the aspects of cronyism of special interests was lower on average, right? Which we can argue is a high average. What was sort of a period in history where there was, from what you've seen, less of these types of dynamics?
Yeah, so really, I think the most successful period of reducing cronyism in United States history, and I kind of tie this in with, okay, when did sort of so-called libertarians or advocates of small government have the biggest influence? And this was during the so-called Jacksonian period of the 1830s and 1840s. The Jacksonian Democrats, so Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, founded the Democratic Party in 1828. This was originally a small government, anti-central bank, anti-protective tariffs, anti-government spending party. It's the same Democratic Party. It's the same party organization of today, which of course stands for very different things. And there are a lot of flaws with the Jacksonians, particularly regarding the removal of Native Americans or slavery that we could talk about and put in their context. But the Jacksonians were also thoroughly committed to reforming the economy. And for a decent amount of time, at the federal and state level, they were actually able to achieve this type of success. And at least from my research, why they were able to do this was ultimately, as opposed to why, say, the Jeffersonian Republicans in the early 1800s were not able to, was that they embraced the use of executive power. So they were the ones responsible for using the executive veto to strike down various spending bills at the federal and state local to reform how things such as occupational licensing or licensing of banks and corporations, et cetera. And we've kind of seen this actually play out a little bit in the modern era. Some various cronyism has been stopped by governors, at least exercising or kind of positioning themselves as sort of a strong executive. There are pitfalls to this strong executive approach, which I document, but really, in order to actually accomplish things, it's very hard to do something through the legislative branch at whatever level of government. The only way is you kind of just have to have a president, Andrew Jackson, or even someone later like Grover Cleveland, that they're just vetoing things. They're vetoing spending bills. They're trying to pull back troops or just do something along those lines, because it's kind of, you have to just have one person or a couple people just try and clean up the government from that using that approach.
Right. It's almost like you have to have a beneficial dictator, but I can't imagine that ever being the case, especially in the post-Citizens United era.
Yeah, it's very very tough. You basically have to have someone on the um, posture in a certain way publicly, and then when they're in office, they're gonna. It's the old Superman joke. It's that, well, once you're in office, then you're gonna rip open the shirt. You're gonna be like Clark Kent. You're gonna be the Superman, and then you're gonna clean up things. But you have to have the shirt buttoned up the whole time. And yeah, so the likelihood of that happening, really the likelihood of Washington D.C. being reformed is I think unfortunately very limited. So at the federal level, I think the best um, the most likely chance of reform is at the more state or local level, places such as Florida or other areas, or just even trying to have something like alternative forms of money competing with the federal government. It's unfortunate because I wish I had the answers. If I did, I would certainly hope to advertise them. But it's definitely when in the era when special interests can just dominate a lot. And this happened also before Citizens United, just through more clandestine means of lobbying and bribing people and donating the campaigns. There's some very old tricks that are quite effective at breaking those caps on donations and so on. It's of course just everyone's beholden to a special interest, and everyone always feels that tug. That's one of the themes of my book. That one of the reasons why it's so hard to reduce cronyism is that when you're in a position of power to reduce cronyism, you get corrupted by that power. It's like having the benevolent dictator that then becomes a despot, right? It becomes very dictatorial. Or they just say, well, I've got to focus on the next election, or there are these people I need to cater to, so on and so forth. Or, oh, well, we can actually use this government power, but in the right hands, it'll be fine, right? And then all the various apologies, and they get spun, and then you're kind of back to square one. And it's cronyism is very tough to kill.
How does that the cronyism spill over to the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be in quotes independent? I mean, so I've had people that have worked at the Federal Reserve before, and they will say that they tend to be much more left leaning and more liberal, and they're trying to factor in things like climate change into policy. Um, is that a new dynamic, or is that just sort of narrative?
Well, the Federal Reserve has always had various special interests. We go through history from the very beginning to more recently. I mean, even someone like Jay Powell, excuse me, it's not always advertised, but Jay Powell used to be a partner at the Carlyle Group, right? One of the largest private equity firms. So he's made lots of money. The Powell put, so to speak. So he's definitely a special interest. And we've seen increasingly over the years that more and more economists at the Federal Reserve are actually identifying as Democrat. it's important to look not just at the heads of an organization, but the more lower level management, or just the people kind of collecting data, running through things. What's happening at the Fed, I think, is definitely reflective of it's another example of what's happening in DC overall, in government, various government agencies, and academia. It's just that more and more people in the position of power or the position of authority are identifying as Democrat, et cetera, and that's leading to less representation of, say, Republicans or conservatives, et cetera. But the Fed has always postured itself to be, well, it's in the public interest. The reason why economists are always very pro-Fed is because that's what the data says, et cetera. They don't talk about how well, excuse me, how the Fed is, when they sponsor all the monetary conferences. They're a big source of research funds, a big source of jobs. And so, as Bill and Friedman once said, if you want to be a successful monetary economist, do not criticize the biggest employer.
Yeah, that trend towards more and more identifying as Democrat is intriguing to me. I wonder if you think that, and I don't know, it's not a commentary on Democrats versus Republicans, but if that maybe makes the Fed looser on monetary policy, because a lot of, you can argue, Democrat platforms are around spending more.
Yeah, so I think it makes the Fed looser on monetary policy when the Democrats are in charge. And this is what always happens with the various parties. So Trump criticized the Fed when he was running for office. Then when he was in office, he got mad when the Fed was raising rates. Even famous commentators such as Paul Krugman, who through most of the Biden administration is saying Fed policy is fine, it's not going to cause inflation. Well, you take a little bit of a flashback a couple of years ago when there was the big discussion over the Trump tax cut, and Paul Krugman was saying, well, this is going to be inflationary, so the Fed needs to tighten. Right, so the economists are always positioned to advocate for tighter money when it suits their political preferences. But I think regardless, Democrats, both during Republican years and out, are more dovish. They're not as they tend to discount inflation, and also just for spending. And so, yeah, that leads to a preference, say, for the Fed to keep interest rates low, and this will lower borrowing costs, and this will allow the government to borrow more, et cetera. And I think there's been a trend over the past couple of years. I'm interested to see when it will play a role, when it will surface again. It was a big role in the run up to the midterms. A lot of people forget this, or maybe it just kind of passed. But in the backdrop of all the discussion over rising prices, Republicans were very excited because they thought it would help them a lot in the midterms. That did not turn out to be the case. They basically had ultimately a rather pathetic showing in the midterms. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but there were people saying, well, the Fed doesn't need to tighten yet because they were worried that maybe this will help hurt the Democrats in the midterms. Powell himself did not start tightening until his job was secured. This is more than just coincidence. Once the Senate reconfirmed him, then he sort of postured himself for a tighter policy. Now that the midterms are over, it's in 2020. We're in 2023. Of course, the next election cycle is the big kahuna, the presidential election cycles, especially when there's a re-election or a re-election involved. And so if the Fed has to keep interest rates high throughout 2023, and maybe the recession doesn't happen this year, or it happens later in the year, you're going to see all the calls that, okay, well, the Fed needs to cut rates because we don't want the economy to be too bad in the fall of 2024. And then people are going to say on the other side, well, no, the Fed needs to keep rates high, and you get into all of that. But the Fed has always linked the political business cycle in many ways is always, it always has some relevance to a current boom or a downturn.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that creates errors in policy, right? Because errors in policy are ultimately about timing, right? So if Powell was delaying raising rates because he wanted the reconfirmation, that's an error, but it was an error based on his incentive to stay in his position. I'm curious if you think that there's something to the idea of not having monetary policy set by human beings, that it's more quantitatively driven as opposed to decided by those that have hidden incentives to act the way they act?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's been something discussed throughout the history of monetary policy, especially in the more modern era when you've got computers and I mean hell even now artificial intelligence and what that's going to do. That those kind of disruptions. Should we set basically guide monetary policy or control monetary policy through some sort of rule? Initially, this was through a constant money supply rule. This was through Milton Friedman. Now you hear proposals about constant nominal GDP targeting, nominal gross domestic product targeting, which is a way of trying to target spending, say a constant level of spending. This will prevent high inflation or recessions. I think a rule is ultimately better than discretionary fine tuning, which is what we have. The problem is, I still don't think it goes far enough because I'm against the central bank in principle, both theoretically and empirically. So I think having that as a halfway point can be dangerous. And then there's issues over, well, what kind of rule? And then there's more fundamentally over issues of, okay, how much of a rule is this actually going to be? Is there still an escape hatch, so to speak? Rules only matter when they bite, right? And when they bite is when politicians get upset, Wall Street gets upset, et cetera, and then there's pressure to revise the rule. It's the equivalent of you're going on a diet and you need to put the cookies away. All right, well, when you start to get hungry or start to crave a cookie, how much can you actually discipline yourself to not eat that cookie, right? Was the cookies put behind a lock that you actually don't have the key to, or are you in a position to just open up the cabinet and the pantry and get the cookies that you want? So I think rules can be effective. I think they'd be better than where we are now. The issue is it's just how likely of that is that to happen, and also it's really I'll believe it when I see it, kind of like a rule that will actually, when push comes to shove, constrain the central bank, which is particularly during a period of crisis and during periods of crises, such as during the financial crisis or during COVID, is when governments always go for the power grab and they're always trying to fine tune things to suit their own goals.
Maybe for the remaining few minutes here, I think that's probably a good transition to just get your thoughts on Bitcoin then, because that's constraining, right? And a lot of economists, would argue maybe that it would make the system more volatile. Those that are big Bitcoin advocates would argue the opposite. I'm curious, how do you think about that from a modeling framework? You can't discount the possibility that maybe we are headed for a world where it's all going to be digital currency.
So I'm ultimately bullish on Bitcoin. Do I think it's going to go to the stratospheres as some people argue, or sometimes Bitcoin maximalists that it's the only type of cryptocurrency, or that it's always poised for success? I do think bubbles can form, is what we clearly saw. I'm also, earlier on, I'm still earlier on before Bitcoin. There's also gold and silver. I'm still bullish on that. At least it's not certainly going to go to nearly as high as Bitcoin, or probably be as widespread, but it's definitely more stable, which can, for some people, is the type of investment they need. I think these types of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, have potential. I think their likelihood of them being spent, there's still some issues in that right now it's mainly an investment hedge. There needs to be more and more data that comes out actually showing people are spending Bitcoin on things. One of the reasons why they're not doing that is, of course, I guess there's various tax laws when you're selling, a Bitcoin. Various companies they maybe sounded happy to accept it. I'm thinking of Tesla in early 2021, but then they quickly backtracked because of they said environmental reasons, but the likely reason was just some sort of government antitrust suit or crackdown on them, et cetera. I mean, I think that it's definitely something central banks are afraid of, and there's a potential for them to be utilized. There still needs to be more work done on that. It's going to be, I think, more gradual than what people are hoping for. Bitcoin, of course, has had a huge descent, a huge decline in price from about 61,000. It went as low as, I guess, 16,000. It's kind of bumped up a little bit now. And is it going to be more steady from there? Is it going to rise a little bit? It's something that's promising, but it's also something that a lot of people can get overly optimistic about, and I think that leads to problems with investments they might make.
Right. I think it goes back to it's hard to get incentives around that aligned properly when those in power are in power because of fiat to begin with.
Mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely. The Fed, and there was a report that was a lot of people were waiting on, saying, well, the Fed has a report on cryptocurrency, or digital currencies. Or people saying, well, it's a central bank going to get involved in this, and they say, well, we need to stop this because of speculation, or here's some sob story about person one being hurt, or the whole FTX blow up and all of that, and or this is facilitating black market transactions of all sorts of things like that. And those are usually the stated reasons. The real reason as to why governments don't want this is because if more people use currencies other than the dollar, that leads to a decline in tax revenue. Ultimately, there are ways that the government would try to collect tax revenue, or a sales tax or something else in Bitcoin, or have it be exchanged. But if more and more people use it, that leads to a decline in the use of the dollar. That leads to less tax revenue. Also leads to higher prices as people are trying to spend dollars more quickly. Not saying that's happening now, at least regarding the dollar vis-a-vis Bitcoin. But it's something that could happen, which is why they don't want that. And we saw this happen in China. It could happen here. But if these types of Bitcoin and other types of cryptocurrencies take off, then you will absolutely, I'm convinced, you will see government crack down on it. They will not lose the tax revenue. I can guarantee you that. Looking at cronyism throughout history, if there is one crime you are going to commit, just make sure it's not counterfeiting. Do not mess with the government's most important monopoly from their perspective, which is the power to print money. This has always turned out bad for people. So if you're willing to take the risk, go for it. But it never works out. Never works out well, unfortunately.
I think it's a good place to wrap this Twitter Space up. Again, everybody, please make sure you follow Dr. Patrick Newman. Check out Cronyism on Amazon, all your favorite places, platforms as well. I'm doing another 2 spaces back to back. So please, folks, join me in about 5 minutes. And thank you, Patrick, for spending some time with us here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.